Tonight's speaker is Marti Londal, chapter president with the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society since 2015. She has served many roles, including chapter president, marketing director, regional director, and Nevis Unveiling Committee member. She graduated from the University of Michigan, majoring in business and minoring in American history, and she developed a passion for all things Alexander Hamilton long before the musical. She loves confronting myths propagated by the musical and going beyond traditional textbooks to examine how precedents set 250 years ago are still very much a part of our daily lives. I'm very excited to have her here tonight, so please welcome Marti Londal.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you to you all for setting aside an hour to come talk about Alexander Hamilton with me because it's my most favorite thing to talk about. So we're going to have some fun today. Let's start out with a quick poll. For those of you who are virtual, there is a chat button. Can you let us know if you have seen the musical either in person or Disney Plus? They both count. Got lots of yeses. The musical's been out for a while, so I anticipated a lot of yeses, but it's always good to see who we're talking about here. All right, so I work with the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and we are a 501c3 organization dedicated to educating the public about Alexander Hamilton. Oh, we got a no. Mr. Mike Kruger, you got to get on this and see it. So the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, we work to pair up academics and researchers and historical sites and students and get people talking about Alexander Hamilton. We were founded in 2011, and that date means that we were founded before the musical. So we were nerds before it was cool. Let's zoom out for a second and look at kind of Hamilton's moment in recent pop culture. So let's take you back all the way to 2009. I know it was a really long time ago. Lin-Manuel attended the White House Poetry Jam and rapped what would become the first song of the musical. Obama was nice enough to snap along, but everyone else kind of thought he was nuts. And a lot of people had no idea who Alexander Hamilton even was. So this was one of the first public viewings of what would become the musical, and it was really exciting for historians. Then in 2011, the Awareness Society was founded because really nobody knew who Hamilton was. They had either never heard of him or they thought he was a president. I remember driving in my car one day and there was a trivia question and it asked who was the only non-president on money. And the caller won by saying Ben Franklin. And I just gripped my steering wheel and I was like, but what about Hamilton? So I got really mad. People should know that there are non-presidents on money. So then in 2013, the Hamilton mixtape was read at Vassar. So that was some of the beginnings of the lyrics that would develop into the musical, and the musical got funding and proceeded forward. And in January of 2015, it premiered at the Public Theater. I was so excited because how often do you get a rap musical about your favorite founding father? So I walked up and I asked the usher, like, how many people are here for this? Are they more history people or are they more theater people? And he was completely serious and he looked at me and he said, there are history people? And I was like, yeah, hi, nice to meet you. So we enjoyed that, got to meet Lin-Manuel. That was cool. Then fast forward to July 2015, Hamilton went to Broadway. The Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society helped consult a little bit, so we got to go to the premiere. And amongst all of this success and popularity of Alexander Hamilton kind of resurging on the scene, in the summer of 2015, that same summer, then Treasury Secretary Jack Lew decided that they would take Hamilton off the $10 bill. So there was a big public outcry. The descendants got involved. We had a huge Save Hamilton campaign, and we got them to keep Hamilton on the $10 bill, which is really where we think he belongs. So there are, streets named after Hamilton and statues of Hamilton everywhere, but really his face on the currency that he helped create for the nation that he helped found, I think is one of the best monuments that we can have to Hamilton. So that's where we hope he stays for the foreseeable future. And usually I am in person. So this is a virtual at least for me. And so I wanted to show you a close-up of my playbill from the Broadway premiere. I actually lent it to the National Constitution Center for a while for their Hamilton exhibit for a couple years ago because it's signed by the original cast. And they sent it back to me because they didn't want it in the exhibit too long, exposed to so much light. And so I hung it up in my office right across from the window. Don't tell my document guy. So now it is complete Hamilton mania, and we love it. We love how many people are now excited about the founding era and how many people are excited about Hamilton and know who he is and know he wasn't a president. And we so love the musical and are so grateful for the musical. It is getting people involved in the conversation about history, not just, East Coasters, research types, but people from the Midwest, you guys, young people, everybody that you can think of is now talking about Hamilton, and we love it. So we are not going to say anything bad about the musical. We are so thankful for it. But there are some very big myths. So whenever some people watch the musical, they always come to us with the same questions. So I just bottled up those questions and put them in one presentation before you guys could ask them. Let's talk about myth number one. So if you'll think back to the first song of the musical, it says that Hamilton was dropped in a forgotten spot in the Caribbean. That first song, like I said, encapsulates the first 20 years of Hamilton's life, and it gets so much right. It squeezes so much history into such a short song. But it doesn't name Nevis by name. Nevis is where he was born. It's a tiny 36 square mile island in the middle of the Caribbean. And it was not a forgotten spot back then, and it is certainly not a forgotten spot now. And as you'll see from some data here, Hamilton was not just from one spot in the Caribbean either. So let's talk about Nevis. It's, like I said, a tiny 36 square mile island. The Spanish settled it, then the British owned it. The French tried to attack it, but they were denied. And today it's its own country, the Confederation of St. Kitts and Nevis, with the tiny island next door. Sugarcane was the major industry during Hamilton's lifetime. And if you look at the population of the island, it was actually 10% white, 90% enslaved blacks. And they were all working in the sugarcane industry and shipping. And just to showcase the importance of the West Indies, in 1763, the British actually debated whether to, when they were restoring territory to France after the 7 Years' War, they debated giving them all of Canada or the tiny sugar island of Guadeloupe. So they gave them Guadeloupe, but they weighed those two land masses equally of value. And Nevis was actually known as the Queen of the Caribbees. So that just goes to show you the quantity and quality of all the sugar they exported. After the sugarcane industry wore out, it wipes out the soil pretty quickly. It became a tourist destination. Just last year, they welcomed 300,000 visitors to St. Kitts and Nevis. It's a cruise stop. Tons of celebrities go there. Princess Diana went there and stayed at Montpelier Estate at the north end of the island. And actually, a couple years ago, the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society went and put up this statue outside of the Museum of Nevis History. It's called Alexander Hamilton as a Young Man. And it just is kind of to mark that he was born on Nevis and become even more of a tourist destination. But back to the 1740s. So we have Nevis, and his mother was Rachel Fawcett. And we don't really know how to say her last name. Could be Fawcett, could be Fawcett. It's spelled 8 different ways when you look at the records. But let's go with Rachel Fawcett for now. His mother's family was from St. George's Parish. So that's that red or that orange southeast section of the island there. All of these sections are named after the major church of the area. So she was from St. George's Parish. Rachel's parents separated, and she moved with her mother to St. Croix, another Caribbean island. There she meets planter John Levine, and they get married and they have a baby. And then Rachel is thrown in jail for adultery. And she was kept there for quite a while. And when she was released, she fled back to St. Kitts and meets James Hamilton. They have 2 kids. They have James, and then they have Alexander. And Alexander Hamilton was born in either 1755 or 1757. or according to Michael E. Newton, a researcher and biographer, it could have been as early as 1754. We're not exactly sure when he was born. Alexander himself declared his birthday to be celebrated January 11th, so that's when I have my cake. But it could have been February, March. There are no birth certificates. The records in the Caribbean are a mess. Half are in Danish. It's rough to go through those. But no matter when he was born, his parents were not legally married. Therefore, Alexander Hamilton was technically a bastard, and we will see that play into his identity throughout the rest of his life. In 1759, Levine divorces Rachel, but she can't remarry. He can, but she's not allowed to. So this is kind of where Lynn gets the phrase son of a whore that he references in that first song of the musical. And I will tell you that I was down on Nevis recently, and the locals have a really big problem with not being named in the musical. It's just a forgotten spot in the Caribbean instead of Nevis, which is upsetting. And then they also have a problem with calling the mom a whore. Uh, Back then, women had so few rights, and it looks really bad to see that her husband could have jailed her for an extended amount of time with no proof, just for infidelity. So it's really sad to look back on her life. But so she was with James Hamilton, and they move in 1765 back to St. Croix as a family because James Sr. needed to collect a debt for his business. And then mysteriously, just short of a year later, in 1766, James Sr. leaves the family. So we don't know whether the marriage fell apart like her first marriage. We don't know if there was infidelity there too. We don't know whether when they got back to St. Croix, he saw the records that said that she couldn't remarry and knew he couldn't marry her and fled to a nearby island. One biographer, Richard Brookhiser, writes that it would have been better for Alexander if his dad had gotten lost at sea and contributed to his great story, but instead he just kind of fled to a nearby island, and it was very sad for the family to live on St. Croix without him. So, as you've heard me mention a couple islands so far, he was not just dropped in one spot. We reference three islands as the Hamilton Triangle. So we have Nevis, that bottom right-hand small island, and these are not to scale. So though that's Nevis, that's where he was born. Then we know that the family moved to St. Eustatius, also known as Statia, where he was tutored in the home of a Jewess. So this is another bonus myth for you. This is where people think that Hamilton was Jewish. He wasn't. We know he was Christian, but he was tutored in the home of a Jewess. That was his teacher. So then the family moves to St. Croix, the third island of the Hamilton Triangle. And St. Croix is where he gets the most pivotal part of his education, says himself. He worked for the trade and charter of Beekman and Kruger. So he got a job when he was 13 years old. And when he was 14, Nicholas Kruger, one of the men in charge, had a health issue and had to go to New York for treatment and left 14-year-old Alexander Hamilton in charge. What would you guys trust a 14-year-old with these days? Because it's not much. It's certainly not an entire business. But Hamilton ran it, and he told seasoned captains what to do, and he handled multiple languages, and he told older people what to do, and he negotiated the cost of goods, and he ran this company as a 14-year-old. And that's where he got, most of his education in terms of exposure to international currency, negotiating with people who are older than him, many different languages. We know he spoke French because his mother spoke French and taught it to him, but he got exposure to other languages as well, and foreign business practices and foreign history. So, different cultures all collided at this shipping port, and he was exposed to all of them. And so he wrapped all of that information up, and he came to America in 1772 after his mother died in 1768 from yellow fever. So the Caribbean was such a major contribution to his identity, not just academically and those lessons that he came wrapped up and brought to us, but also because it meant that he had no state alliance. He was an immigrant. So when he came here, and it was after the Revolution, you had New Yorkers fighting for New York and Virginians fighting for Virginia. and he just wanted one cohesive country. He had no state alliance. He saw a nationalistic view, and that is definitely thanks to him being an immigrant from the Caribbean. So thanks to all of that, we are not going to call Nevis a forgotten spot anymore. And we're going to recognize that he actually came from 3 islands in the Caribbean, not just one forgotten spot. So now let's talk about our second myth. This is for the people who have seen the musical. This is the only time that Alexander Hamilton breaks the fourth wall. And if you've seen the Disney Plus version or the original cast, it's Lin-Manuel Miranda who plays Alexander Hamilton. And they're talking about the ladies and they're talking about flirting. And Burr says they delighted and distracted him. Martha Washington named her feral tomcat after him. And Hamilton looks at the audience and says, "That's true." But it's not. It's so not. So the original story is that Martha Washington named her tomcat Hamilton to suggest that he was lusty and lascivious. Well, that original story was actually taken as satire from a 1780 British captain's journal. And it's quoted here. I can read it for you. It says, "Mrs. Washington has a mottled tomcat, which she calls in a complimentary way Hamilton, with 13 yellow rings around his tail, and that his flaunting it suggested to the Congress the adoption of the same number of stripes for the rebel flag." That's not where we get the 13 stripes. So we know that this is satire already. Then it has been repeated and exaggerated over time, and recent biographies have taken it to mean tomcat as a ladies' man. However, we don't see the evolution of that language until 1927. Before 1927, tomcat meant male cat. That's it. It had no sexual connotation until later when it was defined as slang to mean pursuing women promiscuously for sexual gratification. So it's not true, and it does not mean anything about Hamilton's character. We know that he did go on to have an affair and all of that fun stuff, but that specific story is actually not true. So we're going to bust that myth and thank biographer Michael E. Newton for this research. So since we're talking about the ladies, let's talk about the biggest subplot in the musical, which gives us so many good songs. So it's a great section of the musical, but it's, did he have an affair with his sister-in-law, Angelica Schuyler Church? So let's look at the evidence and see for yourself. This is the letter that was actually quoted in the musical. And let me pause and say that we love how Lynn took actual quotes from primary sources that these characters and historical figures wrote to each other and put them into the lyrics of the musical. So as we were listening to it, and whenever we heard one, we were like, oh, we've read that letter. So I love how he put the actual quotes in there. But this is a letter from Angelica to Eliza that's quoted in the musical. And it says, "I love him very much. And if you were as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a little while. Oh, Betsy, you were a lucky girl to get so clever and so good a companion." So now let's skip to a more flirty letter from Alexander to Angelica, or what can be perceived as a flirty letter. And I will try not to blush as I read it. It says, "You hurt my Republican nerves by your intimacy with amiable princes. I cannot endure that you should be giving such folks dinners, while I, at the distance of 3,000 miles, can only console myself by thinking of you. Assure yourself that you are as much in my good graces as ever, and that you must be a very naughty girl indeed before you can lose the place you have in my affection. Adieu, very dear sister-in-law." So I wouldn't love if my husband wrote that to another woman, let alone my sister. Wouldn't love it. Don't like how it says any of that stuff. But we know that Eliza actually saw this letter because she wrote a postscript at the bottom. So not only did she read it to the end, but she commented at the end after reading it, this. It says, "My Hamilton and I often talk about you with great pleasure and earnestly wish that you could again be added to our little circle, but we dare scarcely hope for so great a happiness." So his wife read the whole letter and then writes, "We can't wait to see you again, sister." So this was not secret correspondence between lovers. This was not a deleted text or a hidden email or anything like that. This was the family letters. They would arrive at the door and the whole family would get excited to read, what Uncle Alexander or Aunt Angelica wrote, and the whole family would write their responses back and on the same page, and then they would send it away. So we know that the whole family was aware that he had written this, which gives it less of a clandestine kind of flirty feel. And then let's zoom out again and look at the timeline of what would be the supposed affair. So Alexander Hamilton courted his wife, Eliza, at Dr. Campfield's house in Morristown, New Jersey in the winter of 1780. So Hamilton was staying at the military headquarters of Ford Mansion with Washington and the other family. So that was the group of aides that traveled with Washington. They were all staying at Ford's Mansion in Morristown. And not too far down the road was Dr. Campfield's house, where the Surgeon General at the time, Dr. Cochrane, was staying. And he was married to Gertrude Schuyler. And Gertrude Schuyler thought this would be a lovely place for my single niece to come and meet some military young officers. And so she called Eliza out, and Eliza stayed at Dr. Campfield's house, was courted by, and fell in love with Hamilton that very winter. And they were married in December of 1780 at the Schuyler family home, which is known as the Pastures in Albany. But Angelica was already married when they met. So that's not exactly how it went down in the musical. That's different. Angelica eloped with her husband, John Barker Church, in 1777, 3 years prior. And over the course of when all of their letters were, Angelica was actually living in France. So she was with her family in France from 1783 until 1796. She visited home, briefly, but not regularly enough to maintain an affair. So given that Angelica was already married and her time with her family in France and being so far away from the Hamiltons, and the similar tone of Angelica's letters to other important men, that letter that mentioned amiable princes, she actually carried on similar sounding correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, and who would become Prince George IV, or King George IV. He was a prince at the time. So given that similar tone to other men, we can infer that that was not special for Alexander Hamilton. And we know that Angelica and her sister Eliza maintained a close relationship even after Alexander's death. There were postscripts and notations and proof that this wasn't hidden correspondence between lovers. And so I am going to take the myth busted stamp and put it on this one as well. I can't say for sure. I wasn't there. We know he went on to have another very public affair, but I'm going to say an affair with his sister-in-law is very unlikely. And the last big myth we're going to talk about today is that Alexander Hamilton would never have invited Aaron Burr to help write the Federalist Papers. So this comes from the song at the end of Act 1 called Nonstop. And they are talking about how to build the new nation after the revolution. And it said, Hamilton says, my client needs a strong defense. You're the solution. And Burr says, who's your client? And Hamilton says, the new U.S. Constitution, a series of essays anonymously published defending the document to the public. So what he's talking about here would become the Federalist Papers. And he would never have asked Aaron Burr to help him write them. So at the time, the revolution was over. They had been living under, the Articles of Confederation, and they needed to create a new, stronger central government. So they've crafted this constitution, and now they needed the states to ratify it. The big holdout that they really needed to ratify it was the state of New York. Some other states were on board, and but it really took New York to kind of make this possible. And so Hamilton wanted to write a bunch of pamphlets, letters, articles that would be published to convince the public in New York that the Constitution was the way to go. So he collaborated with John Jay, who wrote 5, James Madison, who wrote 29, and Hamilton, who, according to the musical and otherwise, wrote the other 51. Now, those numbers are what we use today of who wrote what, but they're not for sure because they were all written under the pseudonym Publius. We know John Jay wrote 5. He got sick and then stopped. But at different times, James Madison and Hamilton have claimed different parts of different essays, and we never knew what it was until recently, in 1996, if you can call that recently. An analytics company, a bunch of computer scientists, looked at it and looked at the actual text of the essays that were up for a question, and they looked at who used the word upon more, and the sentence length, and the sentence structure, and the punctuation, and they decided that Madison wrote these 29 and Hamilton wrote these 51. So those are the numbers that we go with today. We also know that Hamilton actually invited another founding father, Gouverneur Morris, to help write, but he was too busy, so he declined. And Hamilton considered William Duer, but after seeing some of his writing, he didn't think it was good enough, and so he kicked him off the project. But he likely would never have invited Aaron Burr. Burr was really well educated. His father was the president of Princeton, but he was not known for his writings or public essays. There's a reason Lynn says that he should talk less, smile more. You will not see any of his writings in your history books. It wasn't going to happen. In 1791, Burr wrote a Federalist congressman that he had not read with proper attention Hamilton's proposal for a bank. That's like saying that a modern politician doesn't know about the wildfires in LA. This is the issue on the table. Like, they should have read the proposal. They should know what's happening. And he didn't bother reading it. And then we're not supposed to talk bad about Aaron Burr. So we're going to take a deep breath here. I'm just going to leave this quote here for you guys to form your own opinions. He instructed his wife Theodosia to, quote, read the little book on the Constitution of the United States. This will save me the trouble of reading it. We also know that George Washington disliked Burr. Burr only lasted 10 days on Washington's staff. We don't even know if he was actually on his staff because there's no official papers. There's nothing in Burr's handwriting to prove that he was, part of Washington's family for 10 days. But the maps and the timing work out that he could have only been on there for 10 days at the most. We know that later Burr wanted to write a history of the war after it was over, and Washington said that Burr should not be allowed to read the diplomatic correspondence, meaning that Burr should be denied a security clearance because he wasn't trusted. Washington refused to appoint him to Minister of France and discouraged then President John Adams from naming him Brigadier General in 1798 because he's brave and able. The question is whether he has not equal talents for intrigue. So Washington did not trust Burr to not be a spy. Washington so fervently believed in the Constitution. He helped write it. So if George Washington didn't like Burr, Hamilton would have never recruited Burr to help write the Federalist Papers that were meant to defend that Constitution. So given that Burr was not known for his writing and that Hamilton previously considered and declined collaboration with another candidate based on his writing chops, and that George Washington disliked him, we're going to say that he never would have invited Burr to help write the Federalist Papers. Now, those are the big myths. But the musical covers so much, and it covers so much so well. And we love it so much that let's just talk about some of the stuff that the musical covers and gets right. So it goes over his childhood and youth as an immigrant from the Caribbean. A lot of times that's left off from the story, so it was really exciting that Lynn included that. It went over his key lifetime relationships, John Lawrence, the fellow aide, his courting and marriage to Elizabeth Schuyler. And I especially like how Lynn extends the musical beyond Hamilton's death. Spoiler alert, sorry. We stick with Eliza for an extra song, and she closes out the show. And she was known after Hamilton died as the last relic of the revolution. So she actually moved into DC, where I am right now, Washington, DC. And she lived with her daughter, Eliza Hamilton Holly, until she died. And so she was right by the White House, and the presidents all kind of came and paid homage to her, and all the politicians kind of came and spoke with her and talked with her about her experiences because she was this font of knowledge, and they had such respect for Hamilton at the time that, they decided to show respect to her as well. So I love how Lynn included that in the musical as well. It went over his mentorship and relationship with George Washington, such an important figure in Hamilton's life. The musical kind of pushes this father-son dynamic that we don't necessarily see in the writings specifically in the primary sources, but it was a very important relationship, and Hamilton would not have become Hamilton if Washington wasn't Washington. The musical covered his children, which were such a big part of his life. It only mentions one by name, but we're going to give Lin-Manuel a pass on that because it's really hard to fit 8 children's names in a rhyming rap musical. So we're going to give him a pass on that. He named Philip. That's good. And the Hamiltons actually took an award named Fanny Ansell. Her father was a veteran. Her mother died. The dad was overwhelmed by debts and other kids. And so the Hamiltons took in Fanny for about 10 years and raised her as their own until she could go live with her sister. So that just kind of shows you the positive family life that the Hamiltons had. And the musical covers his Revolutionary War service. He was a soldier at the Battery. That song where it ends with, yo, let's steal their cannons, shaboom. That's actually taken from a real story documented by Hercules Mulligan. They were at the Battery, which is the southern tip of Manhattan, and they had the cannons out in the field, and the British warships came in, and they wanted to retreat and keep their cannons. So Hamilton hands Hercules Mulligan his gun, and he drags the cannon back. And then the British warship starts firing. So lots of people abandon cannons. Hamilton pulls it back and then goes and sees Hercules Mulligan and says, hey, can I have my gun back? And Hercules Mulligan is like, I left it out in the field. That was crazy. And so Hamilton just walks out amidst the gunfire to get his gun, to retrieve it. Like that's so Hamilton. I just love it. And they included that in the musical, which was really cool. They went over how he was an artillery captain. He was commissioned March 14th, 1776. He was an aide-de-camp under Washington and later got the colonel command under Yorktown. Lots of people usually think of him as Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton. He was actually Colonel Hamilton at Yorktown. So that's a promotion there. He was in the New York State Assembly in 1787 and a constitutional delegate at Philadelphia. And he was Secretary of Treasury and founded the National Bank. He founded the Coast Guard, and I love how the musical, it would be impossible to fit all of his political enemies in one musical or one presentation like this, but it went over the big ones of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Adams. And John Adams actually hurled one of the worst insults at him, called him a bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, which is also where Lynn gets some of those adjectives for that first song. And the musical properly covers the duels and his death. And I put duels as plural there because it goes over the death of his son, who died after a duel with George Eaker using the same pistols that Hamilton and Burr used in their duel 3 years later. But the musical doesn't cover some really big aspects of Hamilton's life and legacy that I think we should talk about since we have some time. So Hamilton helped found the US Mint. It established the dollar as the official US currency. They could have gone with the Spanish 8. They could have gone with the pounds and pence system that the British used, but Hamilton liked the decimal, he liked the dollar, so that's what we have. It established one federal currency. So at the time, each state had their own currency. And then you have international currency, and trying to do trade and commerce was an incredible headache. So one currency united the country and made it easier to do business across state lines. And then one of the most important things that he did, I think, was actually the Coinage Act of 1792, which I know we were all, jumping to say was our favorite, of course. But what the Coinage Act did was Hamilton wanted to print and mint cash in smaller denominations. And so you don't go to the grocery store and buy bread with a $100 bill. You buy eggs with a $100 bill now, but bread, not so much. You want change for that. Well, having smaller currency allowed people to participate in the economy with cash. It allowed people to get change and buy smaller things and actually have in their possession something that says the United States of America. And there's a marketing principle of possession. If you have it, you keep it and you buy into the system. And so all of these citizens were now bought into the system and participating in the economy. Hamilton helped found the US Customs, which had a really tall order right after the Revolution. So during the Revolution, it was one's patriotic duty to smuggle, right? Avoid the Stamp Act, smuggle the tea, all that stuff. And he had to overcome that idea and that sentiment of the public to be able to tax the ships that were coming in to get revenue for the new government and overcome our war debts. And in doing that, he became the superintendent of U.S. lighthouses, which is not an often, touted title for him, but it was very important because you have to be able to see the ships and keep those ships safe to be able to tax them. Because if they sink, we can't tax them. And if they smuggle it, we can't tax them. So that was a very important job. And he was in charge of building and kind of keeping them operational from a management standpoint. The musical also doesn't cover how at one point, Alexander Hamilton was the highest ranking military official in our country, except for the president. So it was the quasi-war with France, and Washington urged Adams to appoint Hamilton as Major General. And Adams didn't want to, but he put Washington first and Hamilton second. So Washington was almost retired. He was at his house in Mount Vernon, didn't want to do anything, but he needed to lend his name as a figurehead. So Hamilton did all the work preparing for this war that never happened. And Washington was at Mount Vernon ready to leap into action if necessary, except in 1799, he died. And so that left Hamilton as the first major general and the highest ranking military official until that army was disbanded in 1800 when Thomas Jefferson took over. So when we talk about Colonel Hamilton, let's actually talk about Major General Hamilton. Then something that the musical does touch on is his legal career, but I think it deserves so much more attention because it was such a huge part of his life, and the musical barely scratched the surface of it. So, the musical has him standing on the desk, flipping the tails of his dress coat, saying, "I practiced the law, I practically perfected it." Well, he did. He passed the bar after only 6 months of studying. So after the Revolution, they waived the requirement to have an apprenticeship for soldiers, and he studied in record time and took the oral exam and passed. He handled a variety of cases, including contracts, creditors' rights, admiralty, maritime insurance, and constitutional law. That's insane. That's so many things. Like today, you would never have a defense attorney handle a corporate law case unless you're watching Suits. But those two things just don't combine. You have different specialties, and Hamilton was able to handle it all. So that just shows the depth and breadth of his legal knowledge. And the musical does mention the Levi Weeks case, but we can talk about more here because it was so cool. It was America's first transcribed murder trial. So it was sensational. This guy, Levi Weeks, was accused of murdering his girlfriend, Elma Sands, and stuffing her down a well. And so this was known as the Manhattan Well trial. Think like the OJ trial or the Johnny Depp trial or all of these things where everybody's watching all the time because it was now printed in the newspaper. Hamilton represented Levi Weeks with actually Aaron Burr and Henry Brockles Livingston. And I know you're going to call me on this. You just said, but he'd never work with Aaron Burr on the Federalist Papers. But they worked together a lot on legal cases because there were only about 35 lawyers in Manhattan at the time, which now you'll find in like a single Starbucks there. But there were so few lawyers that they would team up and then be against each other on different cases. So it wasn't weird to have them team up on this one. And Weeks was actually found not guilty. And since this was all being published in the newspaper and so many eyes were on this trial, it really helped Hamilton's as a marketing tool for his law career because people saw what a great orator he was. He oversaw some really important cases that added to his legacy. So in 1784, there was Rutgers versus Waddington. This went on to establish that a U.S. treaty can trump state legislation. So back then, the Trespass Act was in New York. It was New York state law. And if the British occupied territory and people fled, they could come back after the war and ask for rent. So Elizabeth Rutgers owned a brewery, and Joshua Waddington took it over when the British occupied Manhattan. And then Elizabeth Rutgers came back and wanted rent. So Hamilton actually represented the Loyalist, which was not weird for him. He liked a little underdog case. And he was representing Joshua Waddington, the loyalist, and proved that the Treaty of Paris that was signed by Congress said no punitive damages, and the Trespass Act would be punitive damages. And so he said that the congressional treaty trumped state law, therefore the Trespass Act wasn't valid, and Rutgers was not entitled to repayment. That was a precedent-setting case. Then in 1804, a more popular precedent-setting case is the People versus Croswell. Henry Croswell was a newspaper publisher and was being accused of writing libelous things about politicians, namely Thomas Jefferson. So we don't know whether Hamilton took this case because he knew it would be this precedent-setting case, or if it was a really good time to, churn up dirt on Thomas Jefferson. But he gave a 6-hour impassioned argument for freedom of the press, and it eventually went on to, on the appeal, establish truth as a defense against libel. So back then, you couldn't write anything negative about a political figure, or they could sue you. So Hamilton came in and said, but if it's true, I think we should let it. So we would have a lot more lawsuits today if it wasn't for Hamilton. And then we see Hamilton's lasting influence through those Federalist Papers. So many cases and, judge appointment hearings are, quote, the Federalist Papers, which are Hamilton's words. So he plays such a major part in our legal system even today. 1803, there was Marbury versus Madison. That established that the Constitution was actual law and subject to judicial review. So that is basically why the Supreme Court can say that something is unconstitutional. And that quotes something that Hamilton wrote. There were, in the 2000s, there were the FCC cases that wanted freedom of the press and all that stuff. So all of that quotes the Federalist Papers or Hamilton's People versus Croswell argument. So Hamilton is very much a part of our legal system today. And the other huge thing, yes, we have time. The other huge thing that is not covered in the musical or even mentioned is the report on manufacturers. So this was Hamilton's magnum opus. This defines Hamiltonianness. This is everything that Hamilton wanted for the country. And he submitted the report on December 5th, 1791, and Congress didn't accept any of it. They barely read it. They said, nope. And nothing was heard of it again. Hamilton wanted tariffs to protect industries essential for economic or political independence and raise revenue. And then he wanted industrial subsidies to encourage domestic growth and fund the new nation. Does that sound familiar? Because that's what we have today. So all of these things that were called out by Hamilton in manufacturers was actually incorporated into our system later, and it's the American system, the economy we have now. Due to his political enemies and situations that he has gotten himself into, they didn't read it and didn't care and worked against this. He saw manufacturing as the economic plan that would create opportunities for all. And if you read the report on manufacturers, it's slightly problematic today because he wanted women and children to be able to be useful. He wanted them to be able to work. And it's kind of funny to look back because now we're in a time with, paternity leave and child labor laws and things like that. And so it's kind of problematic, but what he meant was that he just wanted to pave the way for future Hamiltons. So he wrote a letter in 1769. This is the oldest surviving letter that Hamilton wrote. And it was to his childhood friend, Nettie Stevens. And at the end, it's often quoted, it says, "I wish there was a war." People use that to show Hamilton wanted a war. He was an angry young man and he just wanted to shoot guns. But he really needed a global catalyst to improve his station. He was a bastard. He had no name. He had no money. He had no land. When his mother died, all he got were 34 books. And that's it. And so he saw what the war could do for him and the connections that he could make and the lessons he could learn. And that's what he did. And so he wanted to be able to see a country of manufacturing so that all talents could be incorporated and you didn't need a war or a name or money or, proper breeding to be able to be a success. So he wanted to raise the station of everybody and let everybody use their own talents to be able to create an economy. And he saw this through the Society of Establishing Useful Manufacturers. It founded the city of Paterson, New Jersey, right next to the Passaic River Falls. He wanted it as a hub of manufacturing, and the company itself didn't necessarily work out at first because of some political controversies, but the concept was used for future cities later on. And he actually co-founded Jersey City as another site of manufacturing, and he envisioned it would rival Manhattan one day. And whenever I give this talk in New York, they laugh at that because they think New Jersey is ridiculous. Um, but really, it was such a success that the manufacturing moved out, banks moved in, and now it's known as Wall Street West. So it was a success. So we have talked about all the myths of the musical. Nevis was not a forgotten spot. We've talked about the Hamilton Triangle, not just one spot. We've talked about that the Tomcat reference was not true. He did not have an affair with Angelica, his sister-in-law, and Hamilton did not invite Burr to collaborate on the Federalist Papers. And then we went beyond the musical and we talked about more about Hamilton's life. So hopefully he's more than the two-dimensional figure on your money, or even this three-dimensional figure. This is the bust is known as the Sirachi bust. And Eliza thought it was Hamilton's greatest likeness. And so when Trumbull wanted to paint that posthumous portrait that went on the $10 bill, she actually lent him this bust. So this would be the face that we see on our money. And it's in the Grange, which is his home in Harlem, his retirement home in Harlem with his family. So it's in that front parlor, but it's also in Jefferson's back parlor. A copy of it is in Monticello. And when I was touring it, I wondered why I saw Hamilton in his house. And it's because he has this bust of Hamilton on one side of his back parlor. And then on the other side, he has a much grander, larger bust of himself staring directly at Hamilton so that they could be opposed in life and death, which is kind of petty. So, don't throw away your shot. The musical is still touring. I know you guys had it in Chicago for a long time. Go see it if you haven't. It's on Disney Plus. It's an entertaining 2.5 hours, beyond even the history. But also now so many historical sites are open and talking about Hamilton. You can go to the Hamilton Grange in New York City, which is where he retired with his family. He only got to live there a couple of years, but it's a really cool national park site now. And fun fact, so we talked about the Levi Weeks case where he defended him for murder. His brother, Ezra Weeks, was actually the lead contractor on the build of the Grange. So a little tie in there. Go see Trinity Church in New York City. That is where Hamilton is buried, in that cemetery there, along with Angelica and Eliza and a bunch of other names you're going to recognize from the musical. And you don't even actually have to go into the graveyard to see Hamilton's monument, because it's so big and you can kind of see it from the back. And if you're outside the gates, you look up and you see, kind of risen up on a platform, Hamilton's headstone, and it's very grand. And then you look up higher and you see the New York City skyline and the financial district. And so you think, oh, this is a monument to Hamilton. This is his gravestone. But look up, that's the monument to Hamilton, what he was able to build and create, and the economy that we were able to create based on his ideas. You can also come to near me at Yorktown, where he took Redoubt 10 at the Battle of Yorktown and won the Revolution. You can go see the Schuyler Hamilton House where he courted Eliza. It's in Morristown, New Jersey. It's currently run by the New Jersey chapter of the DAR, and they do a great job with programming. And if you feel a Caribbean vacation, go see the new statue on Nevis. Say hi for me. Get a tan. But go and interact with history. And thank you for coming to this presentation. And, go learn about the Civil War at the Lincoln presentations that are coming up at Glenview. But go and participate in the society that Hamilton helped create. Walk where he walked, see what he saw, and see what was built on his ideas. And if you can't go to these places, then just look around, because our entire society is really rested on his ideals and ideas.